What would you do if you overheard your teacher, kind, devoted, and smiling every day, quietly begging her landlord not to evict her? Would you walk away, or would you start a silent revolution? Before we dive into this powerful true story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support is what keeps us going and creating more inspiring stories just like this. It started with a forgotten water bottle. Barron Trump had been halfway to the cafeteria, chatting with Samuel and Mason about a science project, when he paused and tapped his pockets. His bottle wasn't there. With a quick excuse, he told his friends he'd catch up and turned back down the hallway, retracing his steps toward room 204. The school was quieter than usual during lunch. Only a faint buzz of conversation echoed from the gym side. As he neared his classroom, Barron slowed, noticing the door wasn't fully shut. It hung slightly open, the bottom corner gently nudging the carpet. And then, he heard it. At first, just a voice, familiar, Ms. Carter, but not the cheerful, animated tone she used during math or history. This voice was smaller, tired, worn down. "I know the rent's due Friday, Mr. Tannen. I'm not asking to skip. Just for a few more days, until Tuesday. I'll have the paycheck by then." Barron froze. "I understand there's a late fee," she continued. "It's just, I've picked up extra shifts at the coffee shop this weekend. I'm trying." There was a long pause. Barron couldn't hear the reply from the other end, but the silence was almost louder than her words. And then, so softly it barely reached him, "Ms. Carter whispered, "I'll figure something out." He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but he couldn't move, either. It was like hearing something he wasn't supposed to, something too real to look away from. After a few more seconds, the call ended. He saw her head slowly lower into her hands, elbows on the desk. That image, right there, so human, so unguarded, it stuck. Barron turned and walked away, forgetting all about the water bottle. The cafeteria felt like another world. Mason was laughing at something on his phone. Samuel was unwrapping a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with way too much jelly. But Barron sat down slowly, his tray untouched. He didn't hear half of what they said. Ms. Carter's voice kept looping in his mind, shaky, apologetic, defeated. He glanced across the room to the teacher table. She was there, smiling faintly at something a colleague said. But even from that distance, he noticed the circles under her eyes, the quick glance at her phone, the quiet way she picked at a plain sandwich. He'd always admired Ms. Carter. She made history feel like a storybook and turned math into puzzles instead of drills. She never once treated him differently because of who he was. She cared, and that mattered. Now, knowing she was struggling just to pay rent, it didn't sit right. And maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, or how the cafeteria smelled like bleach and mystery meat. But something shifted inside Barron that day. Not a big, dramatic shift. More like a quiet weight settling on his chest. He knew he couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. He didn't tell anyone about what he'd overheard. Not yet. It felt too fragile, like saying it out loud might break something sacred. But that afternoon, as Ms. Carter reviewed their reading assignments and moved from desk to desk with her usual patience, Barron watched her differently. He noticed the tear on the sleeve of her cardigan, poorly sewn but carefully mended. He caught the moment she thought no one was looking and let out a long, tired breath. And when she stopped at his desk and complimented his sketch of the Washington Monument, he smiled back but didn't feel that usual spark of pride. It was replaced by something else. Empathy. On the bus ride home, Barron pressed his forehead to the cool glass window, watching apartment buildings blur by. For the first time, he wondered which one might be hers, what it might feel like to leave school and go to work a second job, knowing rent was still out of reach. That night, dinner at the White House felt hollow. The dining room was too large, The plates too polished. His mother asked him about school. He mumbled something vague. How do you explain to someone that the world feels different now? Because you overheard the kindest person you know trying to keep a roof over her head? He went to bed early. But he didn't sleep right away. He stared at the ceiling, hands folded over his chest. The injustice felt quiet, but heavy. It wasn't loud like protests or headlines. It was the kind that lived behind closed doors, that sat quietly in a cardigan sleeve or in the softness of a voice that never asked for help. And Barron couldn't stop thinking, why did it have to be this way? He didn't have an answer. But a question like that doesn't just disappear. It stays. And it waits. For someone to decide. Maybe it's not okay to just walk away. Dinner that night felt different. Like the air had a weight to it. The table was set the same as always. White plates lined up with silverware folded into thick napkins. But Barron barely touched his food. He pushed the roasted carrots from one side of his plate to the other, lost in a silence that stretched longer than usual. His mother noticed, of course. She always did. You usually finish your potatoes before anyone else, she said softly, trying to coax him out of whatever had taken root in his mind. Everything all right? He hesitated. A long pause. I think Ms. Carter might be having money problems. Her fork paused midair. What makes you say that? Barron looked down at his plate, unsure how much to admit. He didn't want to betray what he'd overheard, but it didn't feel right to stay completely quiet either. She just seems tired all the time, he said carefully, and today I heard her on the phone. It sounded like she was asking for more time to pay her rent. His mother set down her fork. Her face didn't show surprise, but there was something else there. Sadness, maybe, or recognition. That happens more than you'd think, she said, her voice calm. Teachers, especially in cities like D.C., don't get paid nearly what they deserve. Rent keeps climbing, but salaries barely move. A lot of them take second jobs. Some even leave the profession because they just can't make it work. Barron blinked. It wasn't that he hadn't known things were unfair sometimes. But this felt different. These were the people who helped kids grow up, who spent their lives helping others. How were they the ones struggling to survive? But why doesn't someone fix it? He asked, genuinely baffled. I mean, teachers are important. Everyone knows that. His mother gave a weary smile. Knowing something is important and treating it like it is. Those are two different things. Systems get built in ways that keep certain people comfortable, and changing that takes time. And will. After dinner, Barron went up to his room and grabbed his tablet. He wasn't in the mood for video games or cartoons. Instead, he opened a browser and started searching. Average teacher salary, Washington, D.C. The numbers that came up hit harder than he expected. Starting salaries barely covered rent for a one-bedroom apartment. Even teachers with years of experience were making less than half of what many lawyers or tech workers made. And with inflation, groceries, and commuting costs, it was no wonder so many of them were struggling. He read stories from teachers who sold blood plasma on weekends, who tutored after school just to make rent, who skipped their own medical appointments to save money. His stomach tightened. The world he'd always known, a world where people were rewarded for doing good, suddenly looked cracked. And it wasn't just about Ms. Carter anymore. It was about every teacher who smiled in the hallway while silently wondering if their bank account would survive until payday. The next morning at school, Barron started noticing things he hadn't seen before. Ms. Carter's shoes were scuffed around the toes. Her green cardigan, the one she wore at least twice a week, had a loose thread near the shoulder. During lunch, she sat with a peanut butter sandwich and a plastic cup of water. No chips, no fruit, nothing extra. She kept checking her phone when she thought no one was watching, her eyes flickering with worry that never quite left her face. None of it screamed disaster, but together, it painted a picture. one that most people didn't see because they weren't looking. He heard other students talk casually about weekend trips or new phones. One boy bragged about going out to dinner 3 times in a week. No one mentioned the teacher in the corner who probably hadn't had a meal out in months. Barron found himself watching, observing with a new lens. What used to be background noise became signs of something deeper. He saw Ms. Patel from the science department rush out of the parking lot one afternoon in an old Toyota that rattled as it pulled away. Mr. Lin from English wore the same shirt 3 days in a row. He'd never noticed these things before, maybe because he didn't want to, or maybe because no one ever told him to pay attention. That afternoon, as Ms. Carter helped students with a reading assignment, Barron looked up from his desk and caught her face in profile, soft but weary. Her smile never quite reaching her eyes. He realized something important then. It wasn't just about being underpaid. It was about being overlooked. People like Ms. Carter didn't complain. They didn't make noise. They showed up every day, did their job, and carried their burdens quietly. And the world let them. Because the system was built that way. And if no one noticed, really noticed, it would never change. He went home that night and pulled out his sketchbook, flipping past drawings of monuments and buildings. For the first time, he didn't feel like drawing landscapes or city scenes. Instead, he drew a face, not from memory, but from emotion. A tired woman with kind eyes, holding a stack of papers in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Her shoulders slightly slumped, but still standing tall. He didn't sign the drawing. He just looked at it for a long time and thought, something's got to change. Friday arrived with an uneasy stillness that seemed to stretch through the classroom like a tight string. The kind of day where the light from the windows felt duller. Even though the sun was shining outside, Barron noticed it the moment he walked in. Ms. Carter's voice was still warm, but quieter somehow. Her usually neat blouse had a missing button near the cuff, and she tugged at her sleeves now and then, like she was trying to hide something frayed. She smiled at the class, but the smile flickered, like a flame dancing too close to wind. He kept watching, quietly, not like he normally did, just paying attention in class, but truly watching her. Every time she turned to the whiteboard, she glanced at her phone. It was subtle, almost instinctive. Her brows would pinch together for half a second, and then she'd smooth her expression again before facing the students. But the crease on her forehead didn't go away. Barron knew why. He hadn't forgotten the phone call, the voice that trembled, the words she thought no one heard. Rent was due today, and judging by the tightness in her movements and the way she avoided eye contact longer than usual, the money still wasn't there. During recess, while most of the class grabbed their jackets and bolted for the blacktop, Barron stayed seated at his desk. He opened his notebook, pretending to work on his math problems. Ms. Carter didn't rush him out. She seemed almost grateful someone was still in the room. He waited a minute, then another. Finally, he said gently, "Ms. Carter, are you feeling okay today?" She looked up from her desk, eyes blinking like she hadn't expected anyone to ask. "Of course," she said, too quickly. "Just a bit tired, that's all. End of the week and all that." She tried to laugh, but it didn't quite land. Barron gave a small smile. "Not pushing. Well, if you ever need help with anything. I mean, I'm not good at much, but I'm a good listener." That got a real smile. Just for a second. "Thank you, Barron. That's very sweet of you," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "But I'm okay, really." He nodded, though he didn't believe it. After school, Barron rode home in silence. The Secret Service SUV that followed the school bus trailed as usual. But inside the bus, the world felt miles away. His friends chattered about a new video game, a birthday party that weekend. Barron just looked out the window, watching the streets blur by. His mind wasn't on any party. That evening, He shut his bedroom door behind him and dropped his backpack on the carpet. His room, painted soft blue, bookshelves lined with science kits and history biographies, usually brought him comfort. But tonight, it didn't feel right to sit back and do nothing. He sat at his desk, pulled out his sketchbook, and stared at a blank page for a while. Then, without fully knowing why, he wrote 3 words at the top. Operation Help Ms. Carter. He stared at them. It sounded silly, like something out of a comic book. But it was a start. He didn't know how to help. Not yet. He wasn't allowed to give her money. That would feel wrong. And he knew she'd never accept it. And telling someone what he'd overheard, that would feel like breaking a secret she never meant to share. It had to be quiet, invisible, something she could never trace back to him. His fingers brushed across the pages of his sketchbook. Dozens of pencil drawings filled them, landscapes, monuments, little scenes he'd captured from field trips and weekend walks through the city. The Jefferson Memorial in springtime. The Capitol bathed in the golden haze of sunset. A stray cat he'd seen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. That's when the thought began to grow. What if? What if someone actually wanted to buy these? He didn't know if they were good enough. But Mr. Reed, the art teacher, once said his sketches had something most adults lacked: emotion. Maybe that was worth something. And maybe, just maybe, he could use that worth to do some good. He flipped to a new page and began to list ideas. Not polished ones, just thoughts tumbling out faster than his hand could move. Sell art, raise money, donate anonymously. Find a way to help teachers. Help Ms. Carter. He tapped his pencil against the desk, thinking, maybe he could ask his friend Samuel. His mom worked at a gallery downtown. Or talk to Mr. Reed about how artists got their work into shows. Or find a website that sold student artwork. He didn't know the path yet, but he'd taken the first step. This wasn't just about kindness anymore. It was about fairness, dignity. As the room darkened and the shadows stretched across the floor, Barron felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. He was just one kid, but maybe that was enough to start something. Not for attention, not for credit, just because someone needed help, and no one else seemed to see it. He carefully folded the corner of the page and whispered, "I'll figure it out, I promise." And deep inside, something steady and brave began to take root. Not loud, not flashy, but strong. The kind of strength that didn't need applause, only purpose. The art room always smelled faintly of paint, wood shavings, and that musty warmth you only find in old schools. It was Friday afternoon, the last period of the day. The hum of conversation filled the space as kids dipped brushes in water cups and experimented with colors. Some just killed time, messing around with silly doodles or splattering paint. But not Barron, not today. He sat hunched over his sketchpad, eyes narrowed in concentration. The tip of his pencil moved quickly, shading the columns of the Jefferson Memorial. The light streaming through the tall windows caught the graphite just right, adding a soft silver sheen to the edges. He was working faster than usual but with surprising precision, as if some quiet force had settled into his hands. Mr. Reed, the art teacher, balding, kind-eyed, always with a coffee in hand, strolled through the aisles, stopping to check each student's progress. When he reached Barron's desk, he paused longer than usual. "Is this yours?" he asked, his voice warm and low. Barron looked up, blinking. "Yeah." Mr. Reed studied the sketch for a moment, nodding slowly. "You've got a good eye. Light and shadow, perspective, detail. This is more than just talent, Barron. It's practiced, focused. You ever thought about showing your work?" Barron shrugged, trying to seem casual. "I just draw for fun." "Well," Mr. Reed said, tapping the corner of the sketch with a calloused finger, "keep going. With a little polish, I could see this hanging in a gallery. Maybe even selling." He moved on, but the words stuck. Selling. The idea hit Barron like a sudden gust of wind. He sat frozen for a second, staring down at his drawing as if it had transformed in front of him. What if he really could sell his art? More importantly, what if the money could help teachers? Not just Ms. Carter, but any teacher quietly struggling like her? He didn't need a name on a plaque or anyone to know it was him. He just needed it to reach her, somehow. If he made it look like a general fund, a donation, it wouldn't trace back to him. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the White House lawn, Barron found himself unusually quiet at the dinner table. His parents chatted softly about schedules and events, but his mind was elsewhere. After eating, he slipped away to his room and pulled out his sketchbook again. The lines flowed faster now, a view of the Lincoln Memorial reflecting in the pool at dusk. The cherry blossoms near the tidal basin in full bloom. Penn Avenue on a rainy morning. Each drawing wasn't just a picture, it was a piece of something he wanted to say without words. By the time the clock struck 9, he had filled 5 pages. His hand ached, but he didn't care. The next morning, Barron waited for just the right moment. His best friend Samuel had come over to return a history book. And they were sitting on the back porch, sipping juice boxes like they used to when they were little. "Hey," Barron started, almost too casually. "What do you think of this?" He handed Samuel his sketchbook, flipped open to the newest pages. Samuel flipped through them slowly, brows lifting higher with each page. "Dude, these are amazing. Like, for real, did you do all these last night?" Barron nodded. "I was thinking. Do you think people would buy these?" Samuel blinked. "Buy them? I mean, yeah, totally. My mom works at Oakleaf Gallery. Remember? They sometimes do shows for young artists. She might know what to do." Barron hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "What if I wanted to sell them? For a cause? Like, to help teachers who are having a rough time. Quietly, without anyone knowing it's me." Samuel sat up straighter. "Wait, is this about Ms. Carter?" Barron didn't answer directly. He just looked out across the yard, where the wind rustled the tops of the trees. Samuel got it. "You're trying to help her," he said, softer now. Barron gave a small nod. "I don't want to embarrass her, but I can't just sit by." Samuel nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it. I'll talk to my mom." From that moment on, Barron was on a mission. He didn't tell his parents. He didn't ask for favors from staff or assistants. He wanted this to be his. Something real, something earned. Not handed to him because of his name. He cleared space on his desk, setting up a makeshift studio with better lighting. He borrowed watercolors from school, bought canvases with his allowance. Every evening, he painted, sometimes for hours, until the colors blurred together and his fingertips were stained in shades of sky blue and copper brown. The process wasn't easy. Some paintings didn't come out right. Others took 3 or 4 tries. But he kept going. By the end of the week, his room looked more like a gallery than a bedroom. 10 pieces, all centered around life in Washington, D.C., but from his eyes. From the eyes of a kid who loved his city and saw the cracks people tried to ignore. Late one night, he stood back and looked at them all lined up against the wall. This wasn't just art anymore. It was resistance. Not loud, not angry, but steady. It was a way of saying, "I see you. You matter. You shouldn't have to fight alone." And somewhere, he hoped, it might be enough. Not to change everything, but to change something. Even just for one teacher. Even if she never knew it was him. He picked up his brush again and started the next painting. A warm light spilled from his window into the quiet D.C. night, casting long streaks of gold across the grass below. Inside, hope was being painted, stroke by quiet stroke. The morning of the gallery show dawned cool and bright, with a crispness in the air that made the city feel a little more awake than usual. At Oakleaf Gallery, preparations were already underway. Staff bustled quietly, adjusting lighting, hanging frames, and placing soft jazz through the speakers to set the tone. The modest space, usually reserved for up-and-coming artists or local showcases, had taken on a new energy. Though the event wasn't advertised with much fanfare, word had spread quickly. A student, anonymous, young, and deeply thoughtful, was using his art to support teachers in need. The pieces weren't just beautiful, they told stories. Stories of overlooked moments and quiet corners of DC, as seen through the eyes of someone who cared to notice. By early afternoon, the gallery had filled with a soft but steady stream of visitors. Parents from Barron's school came, curious after the newsletter hinted at a student-led art initiative. Neighbors from the community wandered in, intrigued by the idea of art doing good. Even a few local journalists showed up with small notebooks, scribbling phrases like student fundraiser and grassroots compassion. One by one, the paintings were purchased, not just admired, but truly felt. A black and white sketch of a lonely bench near the Washington Monument found its way into the hands of a father who had once been a teacher himself. A watercolor of cherry blossoms, soft, fragile, and full of motion, was bought by a young woman who had been raised by a single mother working 2 jobs. They didn't ask who the artist was. They didn't need to. They felt the intent behind the brush strokes. Barron stayed away from the event itself. He didn't want recognition. Instead, he followed along quietly from home, texting Samuel every hour for updates. When Samuel messaged, "All 10 sold. They're asking for more," Barron's chest tightened, not with pride, but something gentler, gratitude, maybe even peace. The money went into a fund Samuel's mother helped quietly establish, the Educator Relief Circle. It was small, discreet, and purposefully anonymous, but it was real. Teachers facing housing insecurity or sudden financial emergencies could apply through the school in confidence. No need for explanation, no fear of judgment. At school, changes began rippling beneath the surface. Principal Garcia, a tall woman with a calm presence and a deep respect for her staff, was visibly moved when she heard about the initiative. She called a quiet meeting with key faculty and floated the idea of making the fund a permanent feature of the school's support system. "If students are recognizing our needs and stepping up like this," she said, "then maybe it's time we, as administrators, follow their lead." In the teacher's lounge, where conversations were usually brief and tired, something shifted. Ms. Jackson, the science teacher who rarely spoke during lunch, shared that she'd once considered leaving the city because of rent increases. Mr. DeMarco, the gym teacher, admitted he took weekend security shifts. A sense of quiet solidarity grew among them. They weren't alone in their struggles anymore. Someone had seen them. Even the school newsletter, usually filled with spelling bee results and field trip reminders, ran a special feature titled, "Anonymous Kindness: How One Student is Changing the Way We Talk About Support." The article avoided naming names, respecting the mystery, but it celebrated the heart behind the project. Parents wrote in with praise. Some even donated to the fund, moved by the example set not by an adult, but by one of their own children's peers. And though his name wasn't mentioned, Barron began noticing changes. A girl in his homeroom left a small bouquet of wildflowers in the teacher's lounge. A group of 5th graders made handmade thank you cards addressed to our teachers who never give up. A sense of care was awakening among the students too. As for Ms. Carter, she couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed, but the weight she'd been carrying felt slightly lighter. Maybe it was just knowing that someone out there cared. Maybe it was the look Principal Garcia gave her when handing her an envelope. An emergency housing grant that didn't require any explanation. Only her signature. She went home that evening with groceries in one hand and a breath of relief in her chest. The first one in weeks. She didn't know who was behind it all, but someone had noticed, someone had listened, and in a world where silence often meant suffering, that mattered more than anything. Her classroom felt warmer the next day. her voice steadier, and though her eyes still carried the tiredness of long nights and double shifts. There was something else behind them now too, hope, flickering gently but growing stronger. Somewhere in the hallway, a student passed by with smudges of charcoal on his fingers, and a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. It started with a letter. An official-looking envelope slipped quietly into Principal Garcia's mailbox early Monday morning. No signature, just a stamp from the district office and a lot of legal phrasing. At first glance, it seemed like standard procedural communication, but by the time she finished reading the third paragraph, Garcia's brow furrowed deeply. The letter expressed concerns over the fund recently started at Oakdale Elementary. It questioned the lack of formal authorization for the initiative, the unverified nature of external contributions, and warned of the potential risks of unregulated financial activities on school property. It ended with a thinly veiled directive: suspend operations until a formal review is completed. Principal Garcia knew what that meant. Stall, delay, let the fire cool before it spreads. Later that afternoon, she was summoned to a video call with two district administrators, Mr. Vernon Trask and Dr. Meredith Lyle. Both had reputations for keeping things tidy, on paper. At least, Mr. Trask, with his monotone voice and carefully clipped mustache, spent most of the meeting using terms like liability, optics, and public misinterpretation. Dr. Lyle was more tactful but no less firm. "We understand the spirit of what's happening," she said gently, "but when students and private citizens begin operating financial initiatives connected to school staff, there are serious implications." Garcia didn't argue outright. She simply nodded, took notes, and promised to review the matter internally. But inside, a storm brewed. It was clear. This wasn't about financial concerns. This was about image control. If word got out that teachers in their district were being quietly supported through emergency funds started by children, it would raise a bigger, more uncomfortable question: why those systems didn't already exist. Meanwhile, the fund's momentum slowed, applications paused, communication with donors became vague and cautious. A chill swept through what had felt like a warm and growing movement. Ms. Carter felt that chill in her bones. Her landlord, a man named Harold Knox, had always been somewhat patient, but patience runs thin when banks start calling. That morning, she found the final notice taped to her apartment door. No more extensions. She had 30 days. She held the paper in her hands for a long time, sitting on the top step of her building, the morning sun warming her shoulders. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, an alert reminding her to confirm the art gallery date she'd been working on for weeks. A small showcase she'd hoped would help ease the bills. But the gallery had pushed her slot. Staffing issues, they said. Maybe midsummer. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider the option she'd been dreading. Baltimore. Cheaper rent, but a 90-minute commute. That's if she could even keep her job. The school might not wait. And worse, her students, especially the ones who needed stability most, would lose yet another adult who cared. Back at school, Barron noticed something different in the way Ms. Carter walked into class. Her shoulders didn't slump, they sank. He heard whispers in the hallway. Something about an eviction notice. Something about her looking into jobs outside the city. The art gallery show wasn't happening anymore, someone said. Another mentioned she'd been looking at bus routes online. The air around him thickened. His heart beat louder in his ears. For all the good the fundraiser had done, it hadn't moved fast enough. He had tried to act like it was a long-term mission, but now, real consequences were crashing down in real time. Bureaucracy had slowed the gears, and Ms. Carter was slipping through them. Barron found himself staring at his notebook that night. Operation Help Ms. Carter. The title now felt too small, too soft. His pencil hovered, then pressed hard into the page. He began to sketch something new. A woman standing alone under a street lamp. Her shadow stretching behind her. Surrounded by tall, faceless buildings. No warm glow this time. Just gray, hard lines and cold spaces. The system was fighting back. Quietly, but powerfully. And it wasn't going to stop. It was the kind of change you didn't notice at first. Not loud. Not flashy. It was in the way people lingered a little longer in the teacher's lounge. Speaking more freely. In the way parents picked up their kids and hesitated before walking away. Leaning in to ask gently, "How's Ms. Carter holding up?" It was in the bulletin board in the hallway, now pinned with thank you notes and sketches titled, "My Favorite Teacher." Quiet ripples, spreading wide. Despite the pressure from above, the heartbeat of the school had begun to change. Teachers, once used to pushing through their struggles in silence, started opening up to one another. In a Tuesday afternoon meeting that was originally meant to discuss standardized testing scores, the conversation veered, almost unintentionally, toward housing. Ms. Rivera, the second-grade teacher, admitted she'd taken on a weekend job at a catering company just to afford her rising rent. Mr. Lin, who taught history, shared that he was sleeping on his brother's couch after his lease wasn't renewed. What started as a few hesitant confessions turned into a conversation with real weight. They weren't complaining, they were connecting. That same evening, a small group of teachers stayed behind. No one assigned them, no one asked them. They simply pulled chairs into a loose circle in the staff room and began to brainstorm what they could do together. A school-wide fund, a support network, a rotating meal train for staff in crisis. Someone called it the Oakdale Lift, and the name stuck. Meanwhile, word was getting around in the neighborhood. Parents had heard bits and pieces, some from their kids, others through the school newsletter or whispers at the grocery store. One mother approached Principal Garcia and handed her a check, saying quietly, "I heard a teacher might be in trouble. This isn't much, but please pass it along." She refused to give her name. It wasn't about recognition. It was about respect. In the halls, students started drawing more, painting more, writing notes to teachers they admired. Little Julia Thompson wrote a poem titled, "The Light at the Board," and read it aloud during morning assembly. Even the tougher kids, the ones who usually rolled their eyes during these moments, stood a little straighter afterward. Then came the second art show. This time at the community center just a few blocks from the school. Samuel's mother, a marketing manager with a quiet passion for the arts, took charge. She printed flyers, handled logistics, and brought in snacks. Dozens of students submitted artwork, portraits of their teachers, scenes from classrooms, images of hope, strength, and kindness. Mr. Reed, the art teacher, stepped forward in a way no one expected. He announced he would start an after-school Art for Equity program. Open to any student, free of charge. He would teach techniques, host critiques, and help students turn their passion into purpose. What started as a hallway conversation had become something tangible, something institutional. And behind the scenes, Barron worked quietly but steadily, with Mason's sister Natalie helping build a cleaner online storefront. Orders grew. She handled the website and social media with ease, introducing hashtags like #SupportOurTeachers and #ArtForEquity. Every time Barron packed an order, folded the print gently, and slipped in a hand-written thank you card, he felt something new blooming in his chest, not pride. Exactly, purpose. His room, once scattered with video games and science kits, had transformed into a small studio. Canvas pads and ink pens littered the desk. His backpack now carried sketchbooks along with math homework. His parents, noticing the change, didn't push or ask too many questions. His mother, Melania, only once said, "Whatever you're doing, I hope it's making you feel whole." And it was. Perhaps the most surprising shift came from within the district office. Not from the loud voices like Trask or Lyle, but from those who'd stayed silent before. A deputy director, Ms. Connolly, requested a private call with Principal Garcia. She'd been following the community response and was beginning to see the benefit of supporting the initiative. Maybe, she said, we've been looking at this the wrong way. Maybe this isn't a threat to our authority. It's a lesson in where leadership actually begins. For the first time in weeks, Garcia allowed herself a real smile. Change had begun. Not from policy memos or press conferences, but from whispers between students. Quiet defiance from teachers, and a boy with a pencil and a heart too full to sit still. The ground was shifting, and this time, it wasn't being pushed, it was rising. The gym had never looked like this before. Long folding tables, once used for science fairs and spelling bees, were now draped in soft linens, lined with paintings, sketches, photographs, and sculptures. Fairy lights hung along the bleachers. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder with teachers. Students clutched juice boxes beside canvases. And older neighbors who hadn't set foot in the school in decades shuffled in. Curious and warm-eyed, it was a Friday evening. And despite the cold outside, the air inside buzzed with a rare kind of warmth. At the center of it all, under a string of lights that flickered ever so slightly, was a collection of prints that many had come to see. Cityscapes through a child's lens. Ink drawings of classroom moments. A teacher reading to her students. Backlit by sunlight. One piece, titled, Monday Morning Grace, drew the most attention. In it, a woman stood alone in an empty classroom. Her shoulders slightly bent, her face turned to the window. The plaque underneath read, Donated by anonymous student artist. Though no name was displayed, people began to put pieces together. A few whispered, others just stared quietly, then turned to find the boy whose hands had created it. Barron stood near the refreshment table, holding a cup of lemonade that had long since lost its chill. He was dressed in a button-up shirt, the sleeves just a touch too long, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other as more people stopped by his table. Samuel gave him a thumbs up from across the room. Natalie stood beside their display, confidently discussing the prints like a seasoned gallery rep. At precisely 6:30, Principal Garcia stepped onto the makeshift stage near the basketball hoop. She tapped the microphone, smiled at the echo, and cleared her throat. I want to thank each of you for being here tonight. She began. This event started with a whisper. A quiet act of compassion from one student who saw something others overlooked. Tonight, we celebrate not only art, but heart. We honor the teachers who shape our children, and the students who remind us why that work matters. Applause followed, long and genuine. A few teachers dabbed their eyes with napkins. Ms. Carter, standing near her own modest photography booth, blinked rapidly. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She hadn't sold anything yet, but that hardly seemed to matter now. Then, from the back of the gym, a figure emerged, tall, dressed in a gray suit with a district badge clipped to his lapel. Mr. Lyle made his way toward the microphone. His presence caused a brief hush. Garcia hesitated but stepped aside politely. Good evening, he said, voice smooth, rehearsed. It's encouraging to see such community enthusiasm. That said, we must remember that while well-intentioned, any fundraising efforts connected to public schools must follow proper guidelines. We're reviewing the origin and process of this particular fund to ensure compliance. A few murmurs passed through the crowd. Someone near the back scoffed audibly. Lyle continued, Our goal, of course, is safety and fairness for all involved. Let's be careful not to let emotions bypass necessary procedures. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The silence that followed wasn't agreement, it was insulted stillness. Then, quietly but firmly, Principal Garcia stepped back up. With all due respect, Mr. Lyle, what we're doing here tonight isn't about emotion versus procedure. It's about communities stepping up where systems have fallen short. This fund exists because our teachers are living in their cars or commuting 2 hours each way. The system didn't catch them, but a child did. The gym erupted in applause. Barron's heart pounded in his chest. Ms. Carter turned toward the sound, then back to the artwork in front of her. Her gaze drifted to Monday Morning Grace, and something in her expression shifted. Slowly, she walked toward the table and stopped in front of it. She stared at the lines, the shading, the emotion that was somehow perfectly captured without being explicit. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she turned to Barron, who was pretending very hard to be looking at the ceiling tiles. "These," she said gently, placing a hand near one of the frames, "are more than just pictures. They see something most people don't even think to look for." Barron looked at her, eyes wide. "They're beautiful," she added, "and familiar. Too familiar to be coincidence." His throat tightened. There it was. Not an accusation, but a knowing, a quiet confrontation dressed in kindness. He didn't answer. She didn't press. Instead, she nodded, touched his shoulder lightly, and walked away. Mr. Lyle, meanwhile, had disappeared quietly toward the exit. Garcia returned to the mic once more. "Tonight isn't about red tape," she said. "It's about red hearts. Thank you for showing up, for standing up, and for being the kind of community that doesn't wait for permission to do the right thing." The rest of the night passed in a blur of small victories, prints sold, donations made, teachers hugged, but one thing was certain: the curtain had been pulled back. The struggle wasn't invisible anymore, and no official statement could stop what had already begun to bloom. Underneath the lights, in a gym that had seen countless games and assemblies, a different kind of history was being made, not by policies, but by people. And for the first time in weeks, Barron let out a deep breath. The morning air carried an unfamiliar buzz as students trickled into Franklin Middle School. Conversations that usually revolved around cafeteria food or math quizzes were now tinged with curiosity and excitement. A few kids huddled near lockers, whispering, holding up their phones to show the same headline. Across the city, in kitchens and coffee shops, the Washington Post article was spreading like wildfire. Anonymous middle schooler raises $30 for teachers' housing. The headline read. Below it, a black and white photo showed a crowded gym, a wall of student artwork, and a smiling Principal Garcia shaking hands with a local council member. The article detailed the origin of the fundraiser, an anonymous act of empathy sparked by one student's desire to help a struggling teacher. Though Barron's name was never printed, anyone close to the story didn't need it. The timing, the images, and Garcia's quote, "This one act of quiet kindness sparked a shift none of us expected," left little doubt in their minds. By mid-morning, teachers were pulling the article up on their laptops. Parents reposted it on Facebook with captions like, "Why aren't we doing more for our educators?" and "Let's talk about what really matters." Former students chimed in, remembering teachers who made an impact on their lives. A tide had turned. In response, the school district scrambled to issue a statement. It was vague and heavy with jargon, referencing ongoing assessments, budgetary considerations, and appreciation for student-led initiatives. But it couldn't match the raw authenticity of the story already circulating. The public wanted more than empty appreciation. They wanted change. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the library just before lunch, Ms. Carter approached a table near the windows. The sunlight slanted in through dusty blinds, casting warm streaks across the pages of a book Barron wasn't really reading. He looked up and froze when he saw her. She didn't smile, not right away. Instead, she sat across from him, setting her bag down gently, folding her hands. Her voice was even. "Was it you?" He didn't flinch, didn't pretend not to understand. He simply gave a small nod, eyes dropping to the table. "I thought so," she said softly. There was a pause, not awkward, but full. weighted with everything unspoken since that day in the classroom. She studied him, this boy who had walked into her world like any other student, and quietly changed it. "You heard me that day, didn't you?" Barron nodded again. "I didn't mean to. I just forgot my water bottle. I wasn't trying to spy." "I know," she said. He cleared his throat. "I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe someone would help. Then I realized, maybe that someone had to be me." Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but she stopped herself. Instead, her eyes shone with a kind of tired awe. She looked away for a moment, then back at him. "You turned my worst moment into something beautiful," she said, "not just for me, for others, too." He shrugged, unsure of what to say. "You always said in class that history is shaped by ordinary people who notice something's wrong and do something about it." Her mouth curved into a real smile then. "I did say that." They sat for a while in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. It was enough just to sit in the quiet, side by side, knowing a line had been crossed, not one of betrayal or exposure, but of understanding. Before she left, Ms. Carter placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. "It's my favorite photograph," she said. "I was saving it for the next show, but I think it belongs to you now." He opened it after she walked away. It was a picture she'd taken of the classroom one morning. The desks bathed in amber light. On the back, in her cursive handwriting, were 4 words: "You helped me stay." The truth was no longer a secret, and it didn't come with scandal or punishment. It came with dignity, with grace. As the bell rang and the hallway filled with footsteps and laughter, Barron slipped the photo into his backpack like a treasure. In that moment, he knew this wasn't just about art or charity. It was about choosing to see someone, and choosing to act. The truth, now out in the open, had finally done what the system couldn't. It made someone feel seen. And that, in itself, was its own kind of justice. The air in the school felt lighter, not louder, just fuller. Somehow, in the days after the article's release, something shifted in the way people moved through the hallways. Students walked with heads a little higher. Teachers smiled a little longer. And though no one said it outright, everyone felt the change. Barron noticed it too, though he did his best to stay out of the limelight. Still, it was hard to go completely unnoticed when Principal Garcia asked him to speak at the upcoming student assembly. He hesitated at first, unsure of what to say or whether he should speak at all. But after a quiet talk with Mr. Reed, he agreed, on one condition. He didn't want the speech to be about him. That Friday morning, the gymnasium filled with the buzz of sneakers and folding chairs. Banners from the art fundraiser still hung along the back wall, and teachers lined the front row, some still in their classroom cardigans, others with coffee mugs in hand. Barron stepped up to the microphone, small and serious in his plain navy sweater. He looked around, took a breath, and began. "I know some of you are wondering who started the fundraiser. But maybe that's not the most important part. Maybe what matters more is why we did it." He paused, letting the words hang. "Our teachers show up for us every day. They stay late, bring snacks when someone forgets lunch, and explain things 5 times when one of us doesn't get it the first time, or the 5th. And most of the time, they do it without ever being thanked." A murmur ran through the crowd, soft, respectful. This wasn't about being a hero. It was about paying attention. And once we pay attention, it's honest to do something. He went on to thank his fellow students, the teachers who had encouraged creativity, Samuel's mother for helping make the gallery show happen, and Principal Garcia for standing by them when it got hard. By the time he stepped back from the microphone, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was warm, sincere, like something steady taking root. Later that afternoon, as students trickled out of the building for the weekend, Ms. Carter knocked lightly on the frame of Barron's homeroom door. "Got a minute?" she asked. He nodded, setting aside the pencil he'd been chewing on. She stepped inside, holding a manila folder under one arm. "I thought you might like to know," she said. "I'm not moving to Baltimore." His face broke into a grin. "In fact," she continued, "I signed a lease yesterday. It's small, but it's close. And safe." He nodded, the relief settling somewhere deep in his chest. "There's more," she added, holding out the folder. "I'm starting a peer mentorship group. For teachers who are new, or struggling, not just financially, emotionally too. It's being backed by some of the parents and, believe it or not, a couple of district reps who had a change of heart." Barron flipped open the folder, scanning the simple mission statement. "Support grows where kindness is planted." She smiled. "I thought it sounded like something you'd write." He shrugged. "Maybe something I'd draw." They both laughed gently. "I wanted to ask," she said, "if you'd be okay with us naming the network after the initiative you started." "But I heard you came up with a new name?" He nodded. "The Classroom Roots Initiative." She repeated it under her breath. "That's good. That's really good. I thought it was better than using a person's name." Barron explained. "Because it's not just about one person. It's about what grows when we care enough to act." She looked at him, not like a teacher looking at a student, but like someone recognizing an equal in spirit. "I couldn't agree more." Over the next few weeks, other teachers began sharing their own stories. Some wrote short essays about why they stayed in the classroom despite the challenges. Others joined Ms. Carter's network, volunteering to mentor, led workshops, or simply be a shoulder to lean on. The fund kept growing. The gallery prepared a second round of student submissions. The online store expanded with contributions from other young artists. What began as a whisper behind a door had become something broader, deeper. A quiet revolution in how a school could care. And Barron? He didn't fade into the background. But he never chased the spotlight either. He kept drawing, kept learning, kept watching, because he understood now that change didn't always need noise. Sometimes, it just needed patience, and a steady hand willing to reach out. By choosing to see, to act, and to believe, he had given more than money or art. He had given others a reason to hope, and that, in its truest sense, was a victory of the spirit. There was something different in the way mornings unfolded at Franklin Middle School now. The front doors opened to the familiar sounds of lockers clanging and sneakers squeaking across waxed hallways. But there was a new hum in the air, one of steady optimism. It was subtle, like the scent of rain before it actually falls. But it was there, and it was growing. It began with a letter from the district office. A formal announcement that the Classroom Roots Initiative was no longer just a school-level experiment. It had been adopted as an official district-wide program. What started as one boy's quiet response to injustice had become policy, funded, structured, and here to stay. Within days, an online portal went live, allowing educators from across the city to apply for emergency housing stipends. Applications poured in, some from teachers who had been couch surfing for months, others on the brink of eviction, some too proud to ever ask before. Now, they had a place to turn, and a dignified way to stay. Franklin was the first to see the impact. Ms. Hernandez, the science teacher who'd once driven an hour each way from her cousin's basement, finally secured an apartment 10 minutes from school. Mr. Patel, who quietly took on extra custodial shifts in the evenings, received assistance to cover rising rent. Even veteran teachers who had considered early retirement began reconsidering, sensing something real had changed. Beyond Franklin, the ripple spread wider. City council meetings, once dominated by budget arguments, now included dedicated discussions about educator housing. Nonprofits and developers were invited to the table. The idea of affordable teacher housing, once dismissed as impractical, was now under serious review. Numbers were crunched, partnerships explored. What had seemed impossible now had momentum. Barron watched all of it from a distance, still showing up to class with his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He had no desire to be the face of a movement. He didn't want press conferences or camera flashes. But one afternoon, his homeroom teacher handed him a sealed envelope stamped with the district superintendent's seal. Inside was a neatly typed letter, a thank you, written in plain language, acknowledging his courage, creativity, and compassion. It praised not just what he had done, but how he had done it, with humility, persistence, and care. Still, it wasn't that letter he kept in his backpack. A few days later, Ms. Carter stopped him as he packed up after class. She handed him a small envelope, no bigger than a birthday card. "Don't open it here," she said gently. "Wait until you're home." That evening, sitting on his bedroom floor, Barron opened the envelope. A photograph slid out first, an image taken from inside Ms. Carter's new classroom. Sunlight poured through a wide window, framing a clear view of the DC skyline in the distance. It was bright, calm, and full of possibility. Taped inside the card was a short note in Ms. Carter's familiar handwriting. "Because of you, I get to stay, and teach, and breathe." He stared at it for a long moment, then closed the card carefully and placed it in the front pocket of his sketchbook. It felt like something to carry, quietly and proudly. At school, the changes continued. Teachers no longer whispered their struggles in break rooms. They shared solutions instead. Staff meetings began with wellness check-ins. Students participated in art projects about community and empathy. One hallway featured a new mural painted by the art club, a tree with roots stretching deep below, and branches reaching high above. At its center was a quote, "Real change grows from listening." Parents, once skeptical or disengaged, began volunteering more often. They donated supplies, helped in classrooms, or simply showed up, and showing up, as many were learning, was the beginning of everything. As for Barron, he still preferred to sit near the back during assemblies. He still doodled in the margins of his notebooks. But now, his teachers saw him, not just the son of someone famous, but as a person who had noticed something painful and done something kind. And while the news cycle eventually moved on, the story didn't fade. It rooted itself in practice, in policy, in the way people looked at each other differently. That was the real success, not the attention, but the shift. The system that once turned away now leaned in. It started listening, and once a system starts listening, change becomes hard to reverse. The silence that once blanketed hardship had been replaced with voices, some soft, some firm, but all willing to speak. And in that chorus of voices, hope had found its home. Barron didn't need to do anything else. He had already drawn the line, and the world had followed its shape. Spring came slowly to DC, softening the city's edges with budding trees and gentle rains. At Franklin Middle School, the morning bell echoed through freshly painted hallways. But it wasn't just the scent of new paint that felt different. It was what lingered underneath, a quiet, enduring sense of change. Months had passed since the fundraiser. The policy shift, the newspaper article, the initial buzz had faded from headlines, as stories often do, but what remained was far more lasting. Franklin was no longer just a school. It had become a symbol, a kind of quiet blueprint. Other schools across the district took notice. Some mimicked the art fundraiser model, adapting it to their own communities. Parent-teacher groups in neighboring counties launched teacher wellness committees. Even a few high school students created digital platforms to match teachers in need with housing resources, modeling them after the early sketches Barron had once scribbled in the corner of his notebook. What started as a whisper of compassion had grown into something steady, something real. And for teachers who had long endured in silence, it was as if the walls around them had finally developed windows. The most visible change stood in Franklin's gymnasium, where banners used to hang for basketball championships. Now stretched a student-painted mural. It spanned the length of the far wall, full of color and meaning. On one side, Silhouettes of children reached out with open hands. On the other, teachers extended theirs in return. Between them was a broad, graceful bridge made entirely of painted handprints, tiny, multicolored marks overlapping in messy beauty, stretching across a painted city skyline. At the center of the mural was a simple brass plaque, affixed with care, built by kindness, sustained by courage. No name followed, no dedication, just the truth. One morning, Barron passed beneath it on his way to class. He didn't linger. He didn't glance around to see if anyone noticed. He just stopped for a second, looked up, and allowed himself a quiet smile. Not because he'd been celebrated, he hadn't, but because what once lived as a secret in his heart had now become something larger than him. A bridge, both literal and symbolic, stood as proof that one moment of listening could lead to years of change. He walked on. Across the country, the story of the anonymous student artist was still shared. Podcasts mentioned it. PTA meetings referenced it. In cities far from D.C., teachers stood a little taller knowing someone somewhere had seen them not as a cost, but as a cornerstone. Some of those teachers began to share their own stories for the first time. About eviction notices quietly tucked into desk drawers. About side jobs scrubbed from social media so students wouldn't find out. About breaking down in their cars before school, then walking in with a smile. And with those stories came action. Communities organized meals for educators. Some districts allocated emergency housing stipends. Foundations began exploring long-term grants. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to call it a beginning. Back at Franklin, Ms. Carter's classroom buzzed with life. Her students painted posters for Earth Day. She had started leading workshops for first-year teachers, how to thrive, not just survive. And every so often, when the room grew quiet, she'd glance out her window at the skyline and remember that moment. The one where she thought no one heard her, and feel a little less alone. In a final scene, the camera of our mind's eye pans out slowly. Barron, now older, walks past the mural again. This time, he's joined by a younger student. Maybe a sibling, maybe just a friend. They look up together. What's it mean? The younger one asks. Barron replies simply, that you don't have to be loud to build something that lasts. You just have to care. And act. And then, as if turning a final page, a quiet voice enters. Not from the characters, but from the story itself. If you've ever seen someone struggle in silence, ask yourself, what if you could be their bridge? What if one small act of kindness could spark change far beyond what you imagined? Let this be your moment to begin. Tell us in the comments, who was your favorite teacher, and how did they change your life? Share this story if you believe kindness can build something no injustice can tear down. Sometimes, it only takes one quiet voice, one hidden act of kindness, to shake the walls of a broken system. Barron didn't set out to change the world, he just chose not to look away. And that choice became a bridge, not just for one teacher, but for many. What about you? Have you ever witnessed an injustice so quiet it almost went unnoticed? What did you do? Or what do you wish you had done? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Covert Truths so you don't miss the next powerful journey from silence to justice.